Hello and welcome back to the Business of Story. Okay, maybe that's a little presumptuous of me. Maybe this is the first time you're here. If so, we're so glad you made it. I'm your host, Park Howell, and I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the power of story in business, brand, sales and marketing, leadership, HR, you name it. And I do that worldwide. So if I can be of assistance to you and your team, just reach me over at park@businessofstory.com. My whole goal for my business and this podcast is to help you excel through the stories you tell. And as today's guests will share, it is more important now than ever to get your business communications down, because we're going to explore what miscommunication might be costing you. The Harris Poll produced a study with Grammarly that found that miscommunication is costing American businesses $1.2 trillion annually. We're going to look at that and a new study out called The Future of Ambition, and how these two reports portend the future of business and how clear, confident, and compelling communications through storytelling is the only way forward. Now, legend has it that in 1517, Spanish conquistadors exploring the Yucatan Peninsula asked the indigenous Mayan people the name of their region. The Mayans responded with something like Tacatan. I'm not very good at Mayan, by the way, which to the conquistadors sounded like Yucatan. So they named it the Yucatan Peninsula. But what Tacatan actually means is, I don't understand you. That's right, that's what it means in Mayan. I don't understand you. That's why today you can visit the I Don't Understand You Peninsula, one of Mexico's safest, if not misunderstood, states. The explorers assumed they were communicating clearly with their constituents, a miscommunication that is now indelibly inked on the world's stage. According to the Harris Poll that we'll be exploring today, there are 3 assumptions about communications that are at the root of the quote-unquote I don't understand you problem. Are you committing these assumptions at the cost of your organization? Assumption number 1, communication comes naturally to you. It doesn't. Assumption number 2, communication is already working for you. It isn't. And assumption number 3, communication is not a significant source of risk for leaked costs and adverse business impacts. It is. Per the findings, 82% of business leaders are confident in communicating with their direct reports, but only 68% of knowledge workers agree that they're receiving effective communication from their direct managers.
What we did see in our Grammarly data on the communication front is that business leaders actually spend a lot more time communicating, right? Because that's their job. They're not as much on the ground spending time like independently doing tasks. So they are communicating, I think like 80% of their time is spent working with others, communicating with others. So they were actually more aware of the communication issues that were happening.
Abbey Lunney is the managing director of the Thought Leadership Practice at the Harris Poll, a global consulting and market research firm that delivers social intelligence for transformational times. Abbey builds research-driven insights for clients across industries such as finance, automotive, education, health, and entertainment, among others. Designed to capture emerging tensions and trends from a future-forward lens, her work has been featured at Davos, Cannes, and South by Southwest, among other places. One of the insights they uncovered in their State of Business Communication report, which they called The Backbone of Business is Broken, is that 74% of business leaders say, my company underestimates the cost of poor communication. And that 76% of them say, my company undervalues the impact of strong communication, which hints that the cost could be even higher when you think about it. So, what is miscommunication costing you, and what can you do about it? Let's explore that right now with the Harris Poll's Abbey Lunney. Abbey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Park. I'm excited to be here.
And you are what, coming to us from New York?
Yes, sir. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. A steamy morning here in Brooklyn as we're moving into summer.
Are they letting you back into the office yet? Or are you still all working from home?
We are still working from home. Our offices are actually in the World Trade Center, and there is an abundance of caution around security. And since our company is remote first, it's been really easy to just stick with remote working. I'm actually bouncing back to Texas in a couple weeks. I've been kind of a digital nomad for the last couple years. It's been a lot of fun.
Oh, I got you. Are you originally from Texas?
Yep, grew up in Austin and get back there as often as I can.
Oh, good for you. Our son and his girlfriend, Jackie, just moved to Austin in October of last year, and they were both in SoCal. He was in Hollywood for about 12 years, and he just couldn't take the SoCal thing anymore with COVID and the politics and the cost. And he said Hollywood was completely shut down. He's a filmmaker, so he has gone out to Austin. He specializes in virtual reality and mixed reality filmmaking, and he has absolutely loved it. He said it's just the best move. He said the people are so kind. There is so much creativity and technology happening out there. He couldn't be happier.
I am a little bit biased, but I totally second that opinion. Austin is one of the greatest places on earth. It's one of the rare, I've traveled a lot for work, and it's one of the rare places where there's a mix of creativity and hospitality, great food, and just a real feeling of culture that doesn't feel artificial or manufactured.
Absolutely. But this is not an Austin travel log podcast today. We are going to get down to serious business, Abby, and that is the study that came out. And I'm not sure exactly when it came out. I just came across it last week. It's a study that the Harris Poll and Grammarly did on the cost of miscommunication to American businesses, totaling $1.2 trillion in lost revenue, in actual cost, in retaining people. I mean, and that's an annual figure. It absolutely blew me away. So it's like this problem that's hiding in plain sight, but it doesn't sound like businesses are doing a good enough job of taking care of this problem and upping their miscommunication or their communications game. So thank you for that poll. What were the findings that surprised you the most coming out of that?
Yeah, I think what was so interesting about this research, we partnered with Grammarly to just explore the state of business communication today. We actually surveyed knowledge workers and we surveyed business leaders as well, executives, to kind of get their perspective on the state of communication today. We looked at everything from how much time they're spending communicating, what their preferred channels are, how they see the impact of it on their day-to-day lives. And what we see is that, especially in a hybrid world, written communication is our primary mode of interacting with people. In fact, knowledge workers spend about half of their work week on written communication. But at the same time, there was rising concern around the effectiveness of this in the hybrid work era, right? So majorities of business leaders and knowledge workers admit that their team has struggled with effective communication in the last year. And so that this actually debuted in January. So if we're talking kind of the calendar year of 2021, communication was a struggle. And the majority are also really concerned about effective communication in the future as remote and hybrid working becomes a more normalized model. And so some of the things that we saw that were surprising in the data when we started to drill into, well, what's at the root of this miscommunication? There are a lot of gaps, frankly, between expectations and reality, between leadership and employees. The first gap that we saw that was really interesting is that responsiveness is the number one pain point that employees are worried about. They are, when it comes to navigating a hybrid future, when it comes to reflecting on their past experience, the number one challenge that they've reported is actually just hearing back from people in a timely manner. And 61% told us they would actually prefer to communicate in real time. However, their reality is that they are communicating asynchronously a majority of the time via things like chat, email, etc. And so their reality is causing them more stress because they're waiting on responses. They're not able to tap into the responsiveness that makes them feel sort of secure and able to move forward in their jobs.
Okay, Abby, a couple definitions for us. So I think we all know what a business leader is. No big deal there. But how do you define knowledge worker?
That's a great question. So, a knowledge worker is basically someone who works at a 9 to 5 type office job, whether maybe they don't technically work those hours anymore with the way flexibility is going, but someone who works in an office job, typically someone who uses a computer technology to do their job. We looked at people across a variety of industries and a variety of functions within the company, all of whom were employed full time in that sort of office role.
Okay, so they could be either in person or virtual, like we are here, given COVID. So you've got this hybrid thing. Number two, when you were talking about they communicate primarily in written form, does that include what? Everything from email to chats to actual written documents? I mean, when you say written form, is it just anything where they are dealing with a keyboard, basically?
Exactly. Yeah. So that includes writing emails, chats, creating presentation materials, written materials, reviewing others' written materials, even as a form of communication, anything that was kind of written with the intent of relaying a message.
Okay. And so they are having to do most of this communication, as you said, asynchronously, which means not in real time. I'm writing, I'm going to send you an email, and by God, I hope to hear back from you today. And Jesus, don't ghost me. And it seems like ghosting is on the rise. I don't know if you guys are experiencing that, but just the pure zero communication going on blows me away.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think people are experiencing it at scale and hence the kind of stress and anxiety around it. I saw an article just the other day that actually people are now ghosting before they even start their jobs. They're going through the hiring process, getting the offer letter, and then they just don't even turn up on the first day, which is a scary proposition. And I also think that it's a really difficult line to walk now because there's all these conversations around balance and burnout and boundaries, right? And so you don't want to force it on people to necessarily communicate a certain way or a certain schedule. You want to give them the autonomy and freedom to be productive and motivated on their own. But on the flip side, if you've got teams that are misaligned in terms of what expectations are, then you've got kind of a recipe for frustration brewing in the background.
Oh my God, you got a recipe for disaster, right? And let's go to the three assumptions that you call out. And I'm really glad you did this because I see this all the time too. Now, here are the misassumptions, really. Number one, that communications come naturally, and they don't. Number two, communications is already working for you, and they're not. And number three, communications is not a significant source of risk for leaked costs and adverse business impacts. But there's not a greater risk than the lack of communication for, and an example of this, I went and did some digging on like miscommunication mishaps. Was back in 1999, NASA launched a Mars orbiter to go and study the climate on Mars. And they had miscommunication between their engineers who programmed the software using traditional, American units when the other programmers thought they were using metric. They never communicated. They sent this $250 million orbiter on a 10-month journey from Earth to Mars, and guess what happens? It disintegrates upon entry into the Mars atmosphere because of the miscommunication at home. Now, granted, most of us aren't in charge of a $250 million orbiter spacecraft, but you can still whittle this down to this lack of communication, miscommunication, costing you dearly in productivity, and you will talk about that in a minute, retention, keeping people around, and just the pure frustration. Was there any one main finding that kind of blew you away, hit you upside the head on this, around these assumptions?
Yeah, I think really the value that it's costing businesses is just huge, right? When you look, we ask business leaders to kind of consider what is the cost in terms of lost productivity time, in terms of deals and revenue you might have lost, in terms of eroded client relationships due to miscommunication. And one of the interesting things was when we looked at it from a talent perspective and we compared the amount of time that business leaders estimate their teams lose to miscommunication each week. It was about one business day, 7.47 hours a week. So inherently in that, business leaders are getting a 4-day work week that is without even realizing it, right? If a day is spent on sort of miscommunication and back and forth. But even more interesting is when you take that by the average salary that business leaders reported for their team, it amounted to about $12,506 per year per employee that companies are losing in time due to miscommunication. And that's a real hard cost for something that is really avoidable.
Let me run through your math real quick on that, because I thought that was really interesting too. So often, people will categorize communication, storytelling, whatever it is, as a soft skill, and they will devalue that soft skill. And it's quite often hard to put an ROI to what you can actually gain by building those soft skills or lose through miscommunication. But you guys have done a really good job with this. You said the average salary of the knowledge worker was $66,967. So rounded up to $67,000. And this is what your this is what your people told you. So that equates to a cost per employee per calendar day, $47.37. So you can just write off basically $50 right there for every one of your knowledge workers per day that is costing you if you are not paying attention and arming them with communication tools and strategies so that they can be succinct, that they can be clear and get everybody on the same page. As you go through that, then the cost per year for a company of 500 employees is over $6 million. I mean, that is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and the total economic cost is even greater. Gartner estimates there are 100 million knowledge workers in the U.S. And so when you take that, 12,500 per year number times 100 million people, that's where that 1.2 trillion figure comes from. It's a huge economic hit, frankly, to the working world. Yeah.
Well, the assumption number one, you hear comms come naturally to people, and I hear that too. And people say, oh, I'm a natural storyteller. Well, when you sit down, you say, oh, tell me a story. Of course, it's a meandering something that you lose interest in, about 30 seconds in, because we are not natural, especially when we get into a business and organizational arrangement. We want to sound smart. We want to look smart. So we lead with logic and reason, features and benefits. When as soon as we leave there and we go and we grab a beer together, Abbey, and you and I are hanging out in Brooklyn together, then we become natural storytellers. But we shut that off once we move in. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Where in these findings did you guys come across this idea or this assumption that people believe they're already good at this?
Yeah, that's really interesting. We saw that the majority of people think that they are very confident in their own communication abilities. They are also more likely to be confident in their own communication abilities than the communication abilities of others, which is a common phenomenon, by the way. Everyone thinks they're a good driver, but everyone else is a bad driver. That's
Yeah.
we see that time and time again in our data, right? And so there's a real tendency to kind of over-evaluate one's own confidence. We also saw that business leaders, 94%, told us that their organizations underestimate the value of effective communication. And so it could be something that's not quite even fully understood by most people. If you think about how, for example, like doctors, to become doctors, have to go through training in bedside manner and communication, that's an important part of their degree. I don't think many fields actually have that embedded enough as a function of training when it's such the lifeblood of every career path.
And then that leads to that second assumption. Comms is already working for you. So they believe this is, and yet your own data demonstrates that it doesn't. In these interviews, when you went back and gave them, these people, your findings, I mean, was there like shock and awe? Like, oh my God, I thought I was good at this. I thought this was working for us. I need to take a deeper look at really how we are communicating and or miscommunicating within our ranks.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think so much of it gets kind of lumped into this era of work where so many things are changing all the time. We have clients, people, professionals asking, like, how do we navigate this world? And I think a lot of people are chalking it up to this new reality as more of a core competency. But I think that's a little bit short-sighted, to be honest. I think this has been true for a long time, will continue to be true. There's been a lot of questions and interest drummed up as a result of the study of like, okay, so how do we actually create strong communication? What do we need to be thinking about from a tools and training perspective? What do we need to be thinking about from an organizational cultural perspective? And from a leadership perspective, what do we need to be sort of monitoring to make sure that we're not, missing the ball on this one?
What do you tell them? How do you answer that question? What do they use tools and strategy wise?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And there are different ways to tackle it. I think on a foundational level, just starting the conversation about communication is important, because what the research showed us is there's a lot of misalignment in terms of employee preferences and the way things are set up now. So for example, we saw that majority of business leaders say that their teams spend time working independently, but a majority of workers told us that they actually are collaborating. And so that inherently creates a huge gap in terms of the types of training, the types of ways productivity is managed in order to kind of evaluate success. We also talked about the gap between people would rather be communicating in real time, and yet they're forced to do this kind of delayed communication. And so getting a sense of what your team's preferences actually are is really important, so that you can then set up team structures that are beneficial to everyone. So for example, maybe you block off time that is for synchronous communication, right? Like 12 to 2 is your chat window, so that people can feel confident, all right, I'm going to get a response from the team in those hours in a way that's not limiting to people who want more flexibility. So getting that transparency in place is huge, and creating a culture where people can kind of express their concerns. I think that there are also some kind of just trainings and exercises to do, whether it's with tools like Grammarly that advises not only on sort of functional grammar, but also tone, empathy, gives real coaching on how to craft your communications. There are fun things you can do, like presentation karaoke, where you just give a random set of slides and you ask people to present it on the spot. It's kind of like an improv exercise, thinking creatively about that. And then I think maybe I'm just biased because I'm a researcher, but on the third point around measurement, it's very easy to just survey people and ask them. And as long as they feel safe in that culture of transparency you've created in point number 2, to then, how confident are you in your communication skills? What's it like getting communications from others? What are some of the issues you're facing? And just keep a pulse on those things and tackle them as they come up.
So I'm looking at, and this is going to lead us into your next report, and then we're going to do a little mashup of both of them, because this other report just literally came out like 2 days ago, I think. You just sent it to me. And that is what? On the future of ambition, which I think also plays to this communication thing in recruiting and retention, right? So you've got in your first report, the miscommunication costing American businesses $1.2 trillion a year, which just still blows me away. The 4 consequences of ineffective communication. We've already talked about number 1. Ineffective use or just plain loss of time and money. And we've identified you're losing, if you're not paying attention to your communication, 1 productive day per week for your knowledge worker, who is costing you about $70,000 a year to employ. So it adds up. Number 2 and 3, you've got in here the consequence of ineffective communication. fading engagement and productivity. We talked a bit about that too. And you said 80% of business leaders agree that my team will not be able to meet their goals without effective communication skills. So bad communication leads to fading engagement, productivity. And number 3, it also leads to high employee stress, burnout, and turnover. So that leads us into your second study. Well, you've got many, many studies, but the second one in front of me. Let's talk a little bit about what you just released in the findings of the future of ambition. Number 1, can you give us a quick definition of this report and why did you do it in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we as researchers, our practice focuses, the practice that I lead at Harris focuses exclusively on thought leadership. So we're looking into all kinds of societal topics all the time on behalf of clients. And there was this trend that we kept seeing come up that there's a real underlying fundamental shift of values in America that we think has implications across many categories, many areas of our lives. And so we wanted to explore it. We did a study among Americans overall as a population with quantitative survey. And then we also hosted some group discussions to kind of explore these concepts qualitatively, which resulted in the Future of Ambition report.
As I was reading through it, you talk primarily about millennials and Gen Zs in it. Do boomers play a role in your findings here at all? And the reason why I ask is still to this day with U.S. spending, $2.6 trillion of spending is from 50-year-olds plus. So really more the boomer generation, where millennials are making up $65 billion and the Gen Zs are $100 billion. So I was surprised at that. But in this report, when you're looking at what they're doing for work-wise and spending-wise, there's a huge shift. Did boomers play a part in this role at all?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And actually, I just read a really interesting story in Vox that said the next wave of the Great Resignation is going to be the Great Midlife Crisis. And what their data is pointing to is that the first wave of the Great Resignation was a lot of young people, maybe who have lower commitments, more flexibility, easier to just say, oh, I'm going to quit my job and move to Costa Rica or whatever they're doing. But actually what they're seeing now is rising numbers of people in the boomer generation in their 50s, 60s, participating in the Great Resignation, taking sabbaticals, making career shifts. There's part of that mentality. We also just released a study this morning that a majority of Americans plan to live to 100. And so this idea that in your 60s and 70s is no longer even a time to retire if your target age is 100, right? And so people are finding second acts even later in life. And our data showed strong majorities across the entire population, even though some of the points were stronger among millennials and Gen Zs. We saw that 61% of Americans overall say that the concept of what a happy life would mean for me has shifted during the pandemic. So that reevaluation is really strong across all generations.
Well, that's interesting. And let's talk a little bit about the shifts that you found. Shift number 1, Ambition 3.0. Can you give us a little bit of a look at that, of this redefining of ambition and what it actually means to people?
Yeah, I think one reporter that we talked to about this study, the way that she thought of it is sort of the death of hustle culture, right? This pause that we've all taken in our lives has caused us to reevaluate this real strong emphasis on work as identity, work as the primary determinant of lifestyle. And people are taking a step back and they are learning how to sort of rebuild their lives. One of the thought leadership salons that we hosted, the group discussion, someone said something really interesting. He said, I'm rewiring myself around what makes me ecstatic. That is my P0, the top priority for my life, right? So it's not enough to just clock into a 9 to 5 and to just keep going through the motions. People are pausing to say, okay, what really fills my cup and what makes me ecstatic and how can I redefine my life around those things?
Mm-hmm. One of the quotes that I had to laugh at, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit older than maybe your direct reports here, but the quote is, my side hustle is relaxing, playing video games, going on runs, not starting a company. Now, I guess my definition of side hustle is a little bit different. Of course, I am a boomer. raised, give 110% and you work your butt off out there. And I still haven't really found a shortcut for that yet. But to me, relaxing, playing video games and going on runs isn't a side hustle. It's just kind of a hobby.
Yeah, I think that was exactly their point, was I don't need to have a side hustle to be a full person, right? To be valuable, to be contributing. I have my full-time job. I do my full-time job, and I want to have leisure in my leisure time. I don't feel the need to work 80 hours a week to do my job and something else. And in fact, something that we heard was people felt more able to give their all to their careers when they were actually using their downtime as downtime to kind of restore themselves to be able to, again, work better in their full-time jobs.
And I guess that's kind of what led to shift number 2. Energy is today's top currency.
That is exactly right. And I thought this was so interesting because historically, America is, we're a capitalist country. Money, the economy fuels so much of the way our society is set up. But when we asked people if they were more where their focus was today, the majority said that they're more focused on optimizing their energy and time rather than optimizing their money, whether that's their income or how they're spending it. And so they're just getting a lot more intentional, right? One of the people we spoke to said, I realize that being more deliberate about how I spend my time, I can be more present at all times. So it doesn't matter how much money you're making if you're too exhausted to do anything to enjoy it. So there's a recalibration around energy management, focusing on quality of life, again, over this sort of hustle culture.
And did you see any significant markers between Gen Zs, millennials, and boomers? Which generation is more likely to lean one way or the other with these findings?
Yeah, they were more consistent than different across these findings. And a lot of times what we see with these kinds of societal trends is some of the numbers will be similar, but the reasons behind them might be different, right? So maybe boomers are thinking about gearing towards a retirement phase of life, or a phase of life where they're not so governed by their career as the front center piece. Maybe for millennials, it's more about spending time with their kids, right? Gen Zs, it's about pursuing whatever passions they have outside of work. I think Gen Zs are the most likely to set boundaries and kind of think more entrepreneurially about their own careers because they've essentially been managing their own brands on social media since they were, kids.
Mm-hmm. And shift number 3, life in beta. You say that 60% of Americans agree, quote, I am interested in living my life in beta mode where I can experiment and try new things such as new careers, passions, locations, and more. So is this a significant shift out of the America of I'm going to go to work for someone for 30, 35 years, make my money, retire there, have my pension, and move on? Is that just old-fashioned thinking anymore?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's actually I was surprised by how high these numbers were. People have gotten, one sort of silver lining of the pandemic is people have gotten so much more comfortable with change and living in the in-between, even if it's a little uncomfortable, even if it's a little bit less clear and charted out. People are more willing to kind of roll with the punches if it has the potential to bring them greater happiness and fulfillment. And so I think the idea of sort of one linear career is tough. Like we even saw in our data that today success is more defined by being able to learn new skills and adapt to a changing environment than it is by, committing to one deep expertise in one skill set, for example.
So let's mash up now these two findings. If you've got teams out there, both virtual, hybrid, in person, and whatever, and you've got this miscommunication going on, you think it's working for you. So that's a total fallacy. You are pissing people off. You are frustrating people. It sounds to me like they're just simply going to leave. They're like, I don't really care about the paycheck or the quote unquote security of this job, because if I have learned anything over the course of the last 3 years with COVID, there are no guarantees and there is no security in life. You just never know what the hell's going to happen next. So you're frustrating me. You're blowing my mind. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I'm out of here.
Yeah, I think that led to the Great Resignation in a lot of ways. People open their eyes to all of these options. I mean, we see that stress is so much higher in workplaces where miscommunication is prevalent in the Grammarly work. And then when you look at something like this, people are just not going to tolerate the stress if they don't have to. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon then where there's more the jobs that are really great that have that remote hybrid culture and allow people sort of the autonomy to feel like they're working in a fulfilling way, in a way that aligns with their values, as the future of ambition would suggest is optimal. Actually, the number of companies offering those kinds of jobs is quite small. And so there's an interesting sort of division of competition that's happening, where there's this like upper funnel of really great jobs that a lot of people are trying to get. And then there's sort of this messy middle where is a misalignment of priorities and expectations from both the employer and the employee.
Do you think too, and this is just going to be a gross assumption on my part, so you can correct me because you're in the polling business, thank God, and I'm not, that when you were talking business leaders, you were talking typically to an older, person, 45 plus, maybe 50 plus, that boomer that still hasn't quite figured out this communication thing and how millennials and Gen Zs actually want to communicate. And maybe we're stuck in our old ways of buck up, show up, let's get the job done no matter what.
Maybe so. I will say that
Maybe. Is that all I get out of you is maybe?
What we did see in our Grammarly data on the communication front is that business leaders actually spend a lot more time communicating, right? Because that's their job. They're not as much on the ground spending time like independently doing tasks. So they are communicating. I think like 80% of their time is spent working with others, communicating with others. So they were actually more aware of the communication issues that were happening. But in terms of their prognosis for how to fix them, that wasn't something we specifically explored.
Okay. And then I had a question too that came up, and this again is maybe a gross assumption on my part. I'm on page 18, and I know you're not going to flip to it, but it's preferred channels for communication. And again, this is back to your Grammarly report. It says 45% of millennials would prefer to communicate virtual video meetings, so Zoom and Teams and whatnot. So is that because they grew up on digital devices and playing video games and whatever, and they're just much more comfortable being in the virtual realm communicating with people?
Yeah, I think so. And I think Gen Z will be even more comfortable with it because,
Mm-hmm.
this idea of the metaverse, right, is such a buzzword today, but it is inherent to these to especially Gen Z and Gen Alpha. I do think millennials are probably more comfortable than older generations in terms of technology issues. And then also, I think that millennials were craving more of that synchronous communication. So I think the data showed that millennials are spending most of their time with email and chat, and they're actually looking for more of that engagement from video meetings.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. But to me, it doesn't matter what age you are. And oh my God, you threw out Gen Alpha. Now I got to go study up on a whole new Gen Alpha thing coming out here. To me, what we all have in common is we are storytelling monkeys. We are Homo sapiens that think and make meaning through the use of story. And so it doesn't matter what your age is. It doesn't matter what channel you are on. If you can't formulate a communication very concisely, clearly, you are going to lose that audience sitting across from you, again, regardless of the generation they're in. And that's a lot of the work that, of course, we do here is teaching story form, starting with the and, but, therefore. And we have found when you use this, especially in written communication, emails, chat, and whatever, it makes you do the heavy lifting first to do the work to get super clear on what problem you are solving for on behalf of your audience. Writing it from your audience's point of view. So now it's not about you, but it's about them. And then, of course, you come in that communication as, here's how I can help. And in your communication, in your studying here, where you looked at a lot of miscommunication and the cost of it, did you guys dive in at all about actually, and being, Grammarly being a sponsor of this, of course, that's their primary role of just formulating powerful communication. Not so much when and where you communicate, but how you communicate.
Yeah, I mean, we did see that people are looking for tools to help them with that. And they're not just looking for something to correct their typos, right? They're looking for something to help with that empathy, with the clarity, with the overall story that they're trying to tell. And I know my role with thought leadership research is very much using data, which is something that's quite can be quite dry in some scenarios, and telling stories around it and making it really interesting. And it's definitely a discipline that we work in all the time. And so I think the ability to kind of craft narratives is more essential now than ever before, especially if you've got to engage people on their like sixth Zoom call of the day and get them excited about something when you can't build energy in the room and they're so tired of looking at their screens.
Abby, that's the one thing that struck me about your poll. Well, several things have, but I think that you all do a really good job with your narrative to bring these numbers to life. And in fact, I'll even just give you a little kudos here because I don't see this very often. On page 3, this is the executive summary. You actually use a framework that we teach called the and, but, therefore. You probably didn't even realize this, but you are using the 3 forces of story of agreement, contradiction, and consequence in your first 3 paragraphs that set up your entire report. Did you realize you did this?
No, not at all. That I will take the kudos and keep trying to implement that framework.
Well, let me read it to you. So everyone can hear this too. And what I teach too is, look, your team there are good intuitive communicators and storytellers. So you use these, and my argument is everybody is an intuitive storyteller who is a Homo sapien, and that is anybody sitting across from you virtually or in the room. What I like to teach them is how to become intentional about it. So you guys started this with a statement of agreement, and it begins, seamlessly work from home of #work from anywhere. Access secure documents from any network. Hire the best talent based anywhere in the world from wherever you are. So that's all very aspirational, right? It's a statement of agreement. You're getting your audience to nod and say, yeah, that's exactly what I want. But now you use the trigger word, but. Here's the conflict. Here's the contradiction. But what if we don't realize any of those benefits because we can't communicate with each other effectively? So what you've done there, the 3 forces of stories, you began with agreement. Here's what a brighter future looks like to us. Then you have contradiction, but you don't currently have it because we're doing a lousy job of communicating. Therefore, here's the consequence of this study. The Grammarly State of Business Communication Report seeks to answer a fundamental question. What is getting in the way of collaboration, productivity, and employee experience in the hybrid work era? So, congratulations, because if I was to coach you on how I would set up this report summary, that's exactly what I would do. And that is the first framework we teach anybody, anywhere, no matter how they're communicating, is get this and, but, therefore down. Use these 3 forces of story because it does make you empathize with your audience because you're placing your reader at the center of the story, right? It's getting you super clear on what you're solving for. You want this hybrid workforce, but the miscommunication is making it not work for you as effectively as it could. And then you have the answer to it, the call to action. Therefore, here's the report for you to understand where maybe you're missing the bet and what you can do about it.
Yeah, that's a great framework. And I would give kudos also to the Grammarly team. This was very much a group effort in terms of developing the report. But I love that. I think the idea, to me, the most interesting part is the but. I think we're always looking for research that sets up tension in a way that can kind of grab people and maybe surprise them. So I love that idea of kind of establishing a shared vision, demonstrating maybe an obstacle or a contradiction, and then showing how you could help them pave a path forward. I love it.
That's exactly what you did, and you defined that very well. Thank you for that, Abby. So what does the future hold? You've got these 2 reports that I think really mash up well together, miscommunication and the cost of that, but also the cost of losing employees if you're not communicating with them. And they've got the upper hand here. They're holding the golden ticket. They can leave, and they're happy to leave at any moment to go and find something else. What do you see the future holds?
Yeah, I think that transparency is so huge. Like we talked about, just having the conversations, whether it's around communication, but also satisfaction, fulfillment, ambition. There are so many ways that companies can provide value for employees, whether we're seeing a rise in things like lateral moves, right? People just wanting to try something different. And the first step of that is talking to them and communicating and hearing what they need and what they want and what they're interested in. So I think that is a huge piece of it. And I think, just being really clear in terms of what you're offering as a company. And something else that I think is really interesting about it came through in the Future of Ambition study, but we've been seeing it really clearly, and maybe this will appeal to you as a boomer, but we're seeing the return of really traditional values of integrity, fairness, honesty, outpacing some things that might have historically been more popular: innovation, creativity, some of these kind of flashy values, which I think for companies, employers, is great news, because you just have to be authentic, you have to be clear, you have to be fair, you have to be honest, and that can help you attract, retain employees, maintain a culture of solid communication that reduces stress and burnout, and ultimately kind of paves a better future for your company.
Yeah, I think, from the boomer standpoint, the downfall of America all started with the participation trophy. By giving that crappiest kid on the worst soccer team a trophy for showing up did nobody any good in this world, especially in the world of employment. And it is beyond me that people will go through, do these interviews, take people's times in these interviews, accept a job, and then not even show up. That blows my mind.
Yeah, I think it blew the reporter's mind also. I will send you the article. It was really interesting.
Please do. We'll put it in the show notes. Abbey, thank you so much for taking the time and going through this. Where can people find both of these reports and just learn more about the great work you all do over there at the Harris Polls?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Abbey Lunney, and I'll happily send you these studies, other studies we have on topics of interest. We also have our website, theharrispoll.com. We've got a great newsletter, The Future in Focus, that comes out twice a month that sort of explores whatever topics are most top of mind for us that week. So I would say LinkedIn is a great place to start, and I can point you towards whatever resources might be helpful for you.
That would be great. Abbey, will you come back on the show when you've got another really interesting report coming out?
I'd be happy to.
I absolutely enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Park. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for listening to this edition. Man, check out these reports. They will blow your mind. And if you've got any communications challenges happening within your organization, then download this report and get it to the powers that be to help you just become more productive and less frustrated in your own role by learning how to use communications. I always say you've got to understand the magic if you're going to cast the spell. Learn how to tell stories. Learn how to use the and, but, and therefore. Learn how to listen. Sit across from your colleague or your customer, your prospect, and just zip it. Listen to what they have to say and really place them at the center of your story. Understand what it is that they want out of life. Appreciate why maybe they don't currently have it. What is the obstacle or antagonist standing in front of them? And therefore, how can you be there to help them get it? It's literally that simple, but it requires you to listen and to really enact the tools and strategies that this report calls out that people are looking for to just create more powerful, communicative teams that will lead to camaraderie, productivity, and I tell you what, way more fun in the office or out of the office if you're showing up virtually. So share this report, share this episode with anybody you know that could benefit by really understanding the power of communication and the cost of miscommunication and what the future of ambition holds and how that may really impact your current workforce. And of course, if I can help you with your storytelling and story forms, come on over to thebusinessofstory.com. Check out our ABTs of selling and our ABTs of branding courses on Thinkific. 2 very short, quick courses, 3 videos in each of me teaching you how to use the and, but, therefore intentionally, so that you can literally hack through the noise and hook into the hearts of your customers, of your colleagues, of your employees, of anybody sitting across the table or in that Zoom room with you. Thanks so much for listening. Come on back next Monday when we will have another amazing story artist here for you like Abbey. And until then, remember this one thing, that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make sure that's a great one. Thanks so much for listening.